President Trump doubling down on his tough talk on trade, warning against retaliation from the European Union. The president tweeted this threat over the weekend. If the EU wants to further increase their already massive tariffs and barriers on the U.S. companies doing business there, we will simply apply a tax on their cars, which freely pour into the United States. They make it impossible for our cars and more to sell there. Big trade imbalance. Here's what Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross told me yesterday on Sunday Morning Futures about that when I brought up potential retaliation from abroad.
I think what the president was saying was that because we have a big deficit and the other sides have big gains from trade, they have much more to lose in a trade war than we do. I don't think the retaliation is likely to be on steel as such. I think if it is on anything, it'll be some little product in a key state to try to get Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan feeling some pressure.
John Hilsenrath, obviously this was the big debate story on Friday, continued over the weekend with EU coming out and saying, we're going to put tariffs of our own in place.
And your interview with Wilbur Ross was really interesting because he's effectively arguing, everybody calm down, this isn't a big deal. It's just $9 billion in tariffs from us, $3 billion in tariffs from the EU on things like Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Nothing's going to hurt. But the president is saying this is a big deal. He's saying this is going to change the tide of trade for the whole world, and America is going to finally start winning. So there's some disconnect between what the Commerce Secretary is saying and what the president is saying. You know, what really matters is what happens with prices. There's a lot of talk about these being small in amounts, but are our bills going to go up for cars and washing machines and beer cans?
And we discussed this on Friday, Dagan, after that Journal op-ed where they titled it Trump's Tariff Folly. Wilbur Ross basically said these are very insignificant price increases. You know, we talked about the idea of a case of beer. There's not one case of beer that's being consumed a year. But even he said cars are not seeing the kind of significant moves that the Journal has worried about.
I think it's, and I tweeted this on Friday, I think that's actually a ruse, and it's a distraction away from the potentially incredibly destructive impact of tariffs on aluminum and steel, because it's not just about raising prices. And by the way, this could jeopardize way many more jobs than it would ever save. But it's about the retaliation from nations with whom we trade. And again, they're planning to slap these tariffs on nations that are our allies that we need in terms of our national security. And I'll point out just a couple of things, because they were Secretary Ross and also Peter Navarro were on TV all weekend as well, and they said this is a drop in the bucket compared to the overall size of our economy. It's $9 billion. It's only $9 billion in total tariff value. Well, do the math on that. That is essentially paying $5 to $6 million per steel job saved. How does that math work out? And I think to the White House, when you have Larry Kudlow, Art Laffer, and Stephen Moore, critical economic advisors to this president's pro-growth agenda, coming out in the Hill over the weekend and writing a tariff telling him what a bad idea this is. I mean, this is
not only them, but it's interesting who we didn't see this weekend talking about the tariffs. We didn't see Gary Cohn, his top economic advisor.
He's upset about this,
House. And we didn't see Steve Mnuchin talking about it and defending it.
And also Secretary of Defense James Mattis is up. There have been reports that he's very upset about this because, again, you're slapping a tariff on South Korean steel.
Right.
And we need, so again, it's more than just, oh, your six-pack of beer is going to go up and your can of soup is going up. And I'll argue that was, in terms of messaging, that was, I don't know who orchestrated that, but that did not look good last week.
Look, the messaging was really tough, I think, especially for those people who are really, really familiar with the issues. That said, I think a lot of Americans out there in the states that voted for him, like Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, hear this story about trade and they're excited about it. They hear, you know, that we're saving jobs, that we're going to make things fair again, that we're making things right again. So I don't know why people are so surprised that the president is doing it, because he promised that he was going to do it. My big question really is, is this another one of the president's negotiating strategies, which is let's throw something out there, create a lot of chaos, a lot of conversation, and then it gets rolled way back.
To that end, there was a headline yesterday, and I couldn't find anything more on it, but basically saying that China is going to be cutting import tariffs for vehicles as well as some consumer goods. I'm wondering if this is already stoking changes coming out of China just because of his negotiating stance. We can't rule that out, that this is playing poker.
We also had President Xi's top economic advisor in Washington last week trying to talk the president and the White House back from taking steps like this. So this certainly has gotten the attention of the Chinese.
Right.
They have the most to lose in a case like this.
And do you think they're cutting import tariffs on vehicles and consumer goods as a result of this? We don't know anything more about this.
It could be for everybody but the United States. So let's wait. Let's wait and see.
To underline that point, Navarro and Wilbur Ross on my show were very clear to say there won't be any exemptions because there was a feeling that maybe there would be some countries that would actually be exempt from some of this.
This is one of the challenges of this whole deal is that we don't import a lot directly from China anymore because we have imposed duties specifically on Chinese imports. So we get most of our steel from China.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, from Canada. So are we going to actually be hitting the culprit in this global steel glut by doing this? A lot of our allies in Europe say no, that it's just going to hurt them.
We're hurting our greatest economic ally in Canada if you're doing these as broad-based tariffs. But
those NAFTA talks are continuing right now. There's another round going on in Mexico City right now.
And the Europeans who say that the steel that isn't going to get dumped in the U.S. is instead going to get dumped on them. So they've been fighting really hard to get us to work with them to do something to team up on China.
And as Kudlow, Laffer, and Moore write, Trump should examine the historical record on tariffs because they have almost never worked as intended.
Yeah.
And they go through Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1929 that drove us deep into the Great Depression.
Well,
wait, let me finish. The stagflation in the 70s because of the import surcharge that was put on by Richard Nixon. George Bush, again, destroyed more jobs with his 2002 steel tariff than actually existed in the steel industry at that time. And by the way, Lee, you talked about Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Those were the states during the 2002 steel tariff that were the hardest hit by the job losses in other industries, not steel, but in the industries that use steel.
And the thing we have to remember about those 2002 tariffs is they might relate today. The President Bush reversed them a year later.
You mentioned, that's a good point. You mentioned China, the country's 2018 economic growth target, now set at 6.5%. Compare that to what's happening here, about 3%. That is down from the country's growth rate of 6.9% last year, but 6.5% is a serious number, John.
So what that means, so it's March of 2018. What that means, here's a prediction I can make for a headline. In December of this year or January, we'll see the Chinese will say that their growth was 6.7%. So, they're the only country in the world, they say this is what our growth is going to be, and that's the number that we end up getting. Yeah. It's partly because they fake the numbers, but it's also partly because they'll do anything to reach their targets. And you make a lot of mistakes when you set a target and will pull out all the stops to achieve that target.